General considerations for producing and marketing blueberries. In this video, we'll cover production, disease and insect management, and economic considerations individuals need to take into account when producing and marketing blueberries. Dr. David Lockwood, professor and extension uh, fruit and nut crop specialist in the Department of Plant Sciences, will cover general blueberry production considerations. Dr. Zach Henson and Dr. Frank Hale, assistant professor and professor respectively in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology, will cover pest and insect management considerations. Finally, Dr. Margarita Velandia will cover economic considerations for the production and marketing of blueberries. Now I'm going to turn it to Dr. David Lockwood.
Thank you, Margarita. We grow two different types of blueberries in Tennessee, and they're both good crops for us. The first one I'd like to talk about is rabbit eye blueberry. It's perhaps a little bit more common. The rabbit eye blueberry is native to the southeast. It's as compared to the high bush blueberries, which we'll get into in a minute, it's easier to grow than high bush. It's not as sensitive to soil pH levels. It's tolerant of soils having a lower organic matter content and not quite as dependent on supplemental watering. With rabbit eye blueberries, since it covers a fairly wide range all the way from the Gulf Coast on up to Tennessee, there are a lot of different varieties. Some of those varieties are better adapted to our area than others. And so when I look at rabbit eye blueberry varieties, I like to select those that have a high chilling requirement, and that's going to be upwards of 600 hours. You're not going to find anything higher than that in rabbit eye. Some varieties of rabbit eye need to be cross-pollinated from a second variety because without that, you're going to have a very low crop potential. In most parts of Tennessee, we find that rabbit eye blueberries will start to ripen somewhere around early July, and the ripening period, depending on the number of varieties, can last anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks or even longer. The high bush blueberries have two types. The northern high bush are those that we find up in the northern part of the country, Michigan and that area. And then the southern high bush are actually crosses between the northern and the northern high bush and the rabbit eye, and were developed because of their adaptability in the southern region. But high bush blueberries ripen earlier. Normally we'll pick them over about a 4-week period, quite often beginning in early June and going on up into the first part of July. The northern high bush tends to be more cold tolerant than the other types and blooms a little bit later, so frost may be a little bit less of a problem, but they are more difficult to grow. They have a much more stringent soil pH requirement, organic matter content requirement, and they're more dependent on consistent watering. The northern high bush varieties have long chilling requirements. That is 1,000+ hours. We can grow them almost any place in Tennessee, but if you get into some of the more extreme southern parts of the state, we might want to be looking at southern high bush. Supposedly all varieties of northern high bush are self-fertile. That is, you only need one variety. But before I forget, I want to say, regardless of what type of blueberry you're growing, whether it's a rabbit eye, a northern high bush, or a southern high bush, they will fruit better. They will have more fruit, bigger fruit with cross-pollination. That is, 2 or more varieties of the same type of blueberry. Rabbit eye will not cross-pollinate with high bush or vice versa. In the southern high bush, I mentioned that they're better for some of the more extreme southern parts of Tennessee. I would select varieties that have a chilling requirement of about 800 hours. Do not get those that are very low in their chilling requirement. They'll bloom too early. And they ripen over about the same period as the northern high bush. Next slide, please. Okay. Margarita, could we have? Yeah, thank you. One of the things that we look at in any fruit crop, and especially with blueberries, is taking plenty of time before we plant to select a good site and then prepare that site for planting. So in fruit crops, we're always concerned about frost and to a certain extent about disease. And an elevated site that is higher than the surrounding ground tends to give us a little bit of passive protection for both frost and diseases. The soils that blueberries do best in are loamy soils, silt loams or clay loams. We'd like to have a fairly deep soil that is 30 to 36 inches to an impermeable layer. Blueberries are not that deeply rooted, but the deeper the soil, the better they'll perform. We want to avoid soils that have a heavy clay content, that have a high pH, or have high calcium levels. It's very difficult to maintain that desired pH if you run into high soil pH or high calcium. Once you find the right site, spend time, and we're often saying a year or more, getting that site ready to plant. Depending on what the soil pH is, you need to pull it down somewhere to about 4.8 to 5.3. Build the organic matter levels up above 3% for high bush. And if you've got a marginal site, that is where you may have a little heavy clay content, perhaps internal drainage is a little bit questionable, consider building a raised bed, and you can modify the soils by incorporating more organic matter and not worrying about poor soil drainage if you get that bed up 8, 10 inches or so above the surrounding ground. Also, before you plant, get rid of noxious weeds. It's a lot easier to do it then than afterwards. And especially with high bush, put in an irrigation system and have it ready to operate as soon as the bushes are planted. Next slide, please. One thing we do every year, including the year that we plant, is pruning. So when we put out a blueberry bush, depending on the size, I do not recommend 1 year old bushes. I think they're a little too small, but a 2 or 3 year old bush does fairly well. They could be either container grown or a bare root, but quite often those bushes are going to have fruit buds on them, and I would like to get rid of the fruit for the first 2 or 3 years so that we could concentrate on growing the bush and having a big enough plant to give us good fruit and a lot of fruit once it starts to fruit. So the fruit buds on a blueberry tend to occur on the very terminal parts of the new shoots. The buds are bigger, rounder, and plumper than a leaf bud, which is further down the shoot. And you can prune off the tips of those shoots, get rid of the fruit buds. And the earlier you do it, the better off you are. So I like to, when I set a bush out, prune it at that time. Every year we want to prune uh, to build a canopy that's up high so we get good air circulation. It's a lot easier to work the plant too, and shorter, lower branches that are shaded by the growth above will not give you good fruit. So those are candidates to get rid of. We thin out the canopy of the bush for good light penetration. Adequate light is essential for fruit bud development and for good quality fruit, color, and sugar levels. On a mature bush, once you get up into, say, 6 years of age on a high bush, we want to continue or begin a systematic replacement of the major canes in the bush. So we say take out about 20% of the canes each year so that over a 5 year period, we completely renovate the crown of the plant. That keeps the wood in the most productive age range. On rabbit eyes, they're not quite as critical, but I still think about the 7th year, we need to start renovation of the crown, taking out maybe about 15% of the canes so that we can completely renew that crown over time. Next slide, please. Another thing we want to do is look at our fertilizer program. Now, one of the things that I would really want to do is soil test on a regular basis. And in blueberry, it's not a bad idea to test the soil every year. And most frequent cause of problems I see with blueberry production is high pH. And so by monitoring soil pH, we can take steps to adjust and keep that pH in the desired range of 4.8 to 5.3 and not have to make major shifts if we don't monitor the pH on a regular basis. As far as nutrients themselves, in commercial production, we use tissue analysis to determine which elements that we need. Nitrogen will be the one that a blueberry needs the most of, but like most other elements, it does not need much at any one time. And blueberries are unique. They need an ammonium form of nitrogen. So if you're a commercial grower, you might use something like ammonium sulfate for your nitrogen source. If you've only got a few bushes and you also have azaleas, you might look at azalea fertilizer as your source because it's an ammonium form of nitrogen. And low rates, but multiple applications. So here we're looking at, say, bloom, 6 weeks after bloom, and 12 weeks after bloom. So that's the critical thing. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Zach Hansen to talk about diseases.
All right, thanks, Dr. Lockwood. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some sort of general ideas and considerations for blueberry disease management, particularly for things to think about when establishing a crop, and also some cultural practices that you can think about to try to avoid some problems with major diseases rather than having to deal with them after the fact. Of course, in Tennessee and in the Southeast in general, we have an environment that is usually pretty favorable for disease development. So even if all of the appropriate cultural practices are being followed, there's a good likelihood that you're still going to run into some disease issues, and that's where the fungicide applications come in. But we like to do everything we can up front to reduce the number of applications necessary to manage diseases. So thinking about some of those general considerations, as Dr. Lockwood already mentioned, site selection is really important for a number of different reasons, and that does include plant disease management. So in particular, a disease like Phytophthora root rot can be a real problem if you're planting into poorly drained soils, very heavy soils, or even in low-lying areas of a field. So you want to make sure you're avoiding that up front so that you don't invest heavily in putting a blueberry crop in the ground only to have problems with Phytophthora root rot, because that disease in particular is very difficult to manage if you select a site that is prone to those problems. There aren't really good chemical management strategies for that disease, so it's really best to avoid it. You can see some images of the spores in the upper right here of the Phytophthora oomycete or water mold that causes that problem. Definitely something you want to try to avoid. Now, also thinking about establishing a crop, you want to make sure you start with high quality disease-free planting material. There are a number of diseases that can come in on planting material if it hasn't been properly screened. For example, Phytophthora root rot can be one of those, but we can also get some canker and crown rot diseases as well as viruses. So you want to make sure you're avoiding all of those because, again, you want to make sure you get that crop sort of off on the right foot so that you don't have more problems down the road. Tissue culture plants are very likely to be virus-free and disease-free, and so whenever possible, it's a great idea to try to get tissue culture plants. They're less likely to harbor some of these problems. And then also just sort of generally maintaining optimum plant health is really important. There are certain diseases that can really be worsened if the plant is overly stressed. For example, Botryopsvaria is a fungal disease. It can cause a stem blight. It's very common. So even if you start with clean planting material, Botryopsvaria can be found in the environment and can still infect your crops. To avoid worse problems than you would otherwise have with this disease, you want to make sure you're limiting crop injury. You want to reduce your crop stress, so things like proper plant nutrition, proper pH, make sure you're doing everything you can to grow that crop well. That's going to reduce problems with a disease like Botryopsvaria. You also want to avoid late nitrogen applications. After late August, so the plants can harden off properly. That's going to help them avoid issues like winter injury, which again, those types of injuries can allow Botrytis to come in and kind of get a foothold in the crop, and it's very difficult to manage once it's well established. Next slide, please. So thinking about a few more cultural practices, mummyberry can be another real problem for us. This is another fungal disease caused by monolinea. So what you want to do is remove those mummyberries from the plants and the ground as much as possible. The reason we do this is because when you see those mummified fruit on the plant, if they stay on the plant or they fall on the soil surface, that's the overwintering inoculum for that disease. And so it'll sit there over winter. The following spring, spores will emerge from those mummified fruit and reinfect the plant. And so we want to reduce the number of spores or that inoculum as much as possible. And one good way to do that is to remove the mummified fruit. And if it's not practical to get those fruit off the ground, what a lot of growers do is you can sort of rake those into the row middle and then cover them and sort of create a physical barrier between where the spores are forming and the developing plant. So that's a good idea to consider that. Mummyberry is not only a fruit rot problem, it can also cause a shoot blight. And so that's why we want to avoid it. Kind of going along with pruning and sanitation, you want to make sure you're removing any cankers or dead wood. That's going to, again, get that inoculum out of there, get the source of the disease out of there. That's important for canker diseases like Phomopsis and Botrytis. So again, you want to make sure you're pruning that out. And also just generally pruning to make sure you're promoting good air movement and spray penetration. Dr. Lockwood did a good job of sort of explaining why it's so important to prune these crops. One important consideration from a disease management perspective is to make sure that you don't have an excessively dense canopy where you're going to have a very highly humid and wet microclimate. That's going to enhance disease problems, which of course we don't want. The other problem is it's kind of a double-edged sword because on the other side of that, you're going to have reduced spray penetration. So not only do you have more disease in a crop that's not being properly pruned, but also the sprays that you do apply are going to be less effective. And that's really something we want to avoid for two main reasons. One, you're going to get poor disease management, which of course is not good. And on top of that, there's a possibility of enhancing selection for fungicide resistance. So we want to make sure we are keeping disease levels at a minimum through all of our cultural practices. And then when sprays are required, we want to make sure we're spraying the canopy thoroughly so that we're reducing the likelihood of selecting that strain of resistant pathogen. That will allow us to continue to use our good fungicides into the future. So this not only benefits an individual grower, but it benefits everyone in production. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk about specific pesticides that should be used for diseases. There are many diseases. It's really important to become familiar with the types of diseases you would expect to see in blueberry plantings, and then make sure you're also getting up-to-date fungicide recommendations for those. And that's not really the goal of this video, but I do want to make sure viewers are familiar with some really important resources that can help them get that information. First of all, you should be familiar with your local county extension office. There's a wealth of knowledge, local knowledge at those offices, and it's very important for growers to be familiar with those resources. Secondly, the Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium has a website, smallfruits.org, and this is where the IPM and production guides are located. So these are free and available for download at any time. They're updated every year, and this is where growers should be turning to get the latest fungicide recommendations. And so a lot of these guides, so for example, the Southeast Regional Blueberry IPM guide has a spray schedule where they talk about each stage of the crop development, which diseases you can expect to see, and which products are best to manage those. but it also talks about all of these cultural considerations that we've been discussing. So it's really sort of an all-in-one guide, and they're really useful. The other important thing for growers to know is how to diagnose these problems. So when you're scouting your fields, you should have a sense of what you're looking for. And one tool that I really like for this is a free mobile app called My IPM. So if you just go into your the App Store, you can download this for free. There are a number of different fruit crops in there, so you can select just which crops you want to download content for. So if you download blueberry, for example, when you're in that app, you have lots of photographs of different diseases and insect pests. So when you're out in the field, you're maybe looking at something, you're not sure what it is, you can open up your phone, compare it to some of the images in that app to get a sense of what you're seeing. I think this is a really great tool to help growers get a sense of what's out there so that they can really sort of cater their spray program to exactly what problems they're seeing on their property. And with that, I'm going to switch gears. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Hale, and he's going to talk about some insect pest issues that growers should be thinking about.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. Today, I'm going to talk about a couple serious internal feeders. These are the blueberry maggot and the spotted wing Drosophila. They're both flies. They both oviposit or lay their eggs in the fruit. And as you can see here with the blueberry maggot, it's feeding inside the fruit. So these are some of the worst type pests you can imagine on a perishable type fruit like blueberries. The one advantage that we have as entomologists in detecting insects is we have a bunch of different traps available. So we're monitoring for these pests is going to be very, very important. Let's start out here with blueberry maggot. It's not found everywhere in the Southeast, but where you have it, it's a serious problem. It tends to be more mid-season to late season issue. Next, please. Okay, here's the monitoring that we can do. We have yellow sticky traps. A lot of different insects are attracted to certain colors, and so the sticky trap is yellow. We also bait it with ammonium bicarbonate or ammonium carbonate, and that attracts it also. And as you can see, the fly has dark markings on the wings. If you ever grow apples, there's an apple maggot. And with the apple maggot, we often use a red round, like a shape of an apple type trap that has sticky stuff on the outside. But you can see the blueberry maggot is attracted to yellow and this ammonium bicarbonate. If you catch these adults, okay, you want to treat within 7 days of capture and then a repeat application 7 days later. And this whole time you're continuing to trap. If no additional flies are caught, then you can stop your treatments, but continue to monitor. If more flies are caught, then start treating again. Next slide, please. The spotted wing Drosophila, probably the most important pest of small fruit to come along, at least in my lifetime. Of course, came from Asia. And it has the ability, see the female up there in the top right? At the tail end, she has a serrated ovipositor. That means that she can make a cut actually in a blueberry that's just starting to color or change the color of it from green to maybe kind of pinkish red. And she can insert a single egg at a time. The males get the name spotted wing because the male has a single spot on the end of both wings, but the female you can see here doesn't have that. These are a lot smaller than the blueberry maggot. These are more like the little gnats you would see around ripening fruit. So there are other Drosophila in the United States, but this is the first one that could actually attack sound fruit. We can put out traps for these. And what these traps are going to tell you is whether you have spotted winged Drosophila on your farm. They're not going to tell you what level of pressure you have or just how much of infestation. But once if you find them on your farm, you're going to have to consider treatment, preventive treatment. So we make these preventive insecticide applications at least weekly. If it rains, you're going to have to reapply. And we start to make these again when the fruit begins to color all the way through the end of harvest. Now this can be quite a bit of spraying. Insecticide classes or mode of action groups need to be rotated with each application. We don't have that many really effective products, insecticides for this pest, and we tend to overuse them some, but we have to try to rotate as much as possible to slow down the likelihood of developing insecticide resistance. Next slide. As you can see here in the top middle, the egg laying or oviposition will make scars in the fruit. And you can see these with the naked eye. If you take a little closer look with your hand lens, on the top left, you will see a pair of breathing tubes coming out of each egg. So that egg has a live embryo in it. It has to be able to breathe. So the breathing tubes, the egg is stuck in the fruit, but it has a breathing tube sticking out of the fruit. So automatically, when you see that oviposition hole, what's occurred? You've made a hole in that fruit, which is going to be an entryway for disease. It could be, any kind of disease that happened to be on the outside of that fruit could potentially get now inside the fruit, even yeast and things like that. As the larva then feeds, it feeds head first into the fruit, and it sticks its tail end out of an enlarging breathing hole. At the tail end, you'll see little, almost mustard color spiracles. And those are where the air goes in. And that's how it breathes. So it's sort of sticking its tail out so it can breathe. Once that larva is full grown, it tends to wiggle out, or it can stay inside, but it's this one here in the picture in the middle shows it right in the calyx of that blueberry, a full grown larva. Again, these are fly maggots, and it's going to then pupate. And the pupa, you can see at the top right of it, it looks like two little star-shaped things. Those are the spiracles. Now, there are commercial traps available. When I first started trapping for this pest, I just got quart-sized deli containers. And then I drilled small holes all the way around, put a sugar and yeast in water in the bottom, and it would attract the adults. And then I would pour those through a strainer to see what kind of adults I have. In Nashville, when I run the traps, I don't tend to catch them until about July, but it might be earlier other places. We only have a few blueberries at our office at the Soil Plant and Pest Center in Nashville. So what's this going to tell you? It tells you when, it tells you if you have them on your farm, and if you have fruit that are in the susceptible stage, then you need to be treating even before you catch them. And truthfully, if you've caught them 1 year, I would assume you're going to have them from then on. So I would be on the preventive side and start treating. As far as another test we can do is actually mash up blueberries in a sugar solution or a salt solution. And then what happens, these are developing fruit, you mash them up, put them in the water solution, and any maggots will float to the surface. So this is a quality control thing that you can do. Let's say you've sprayed already, you've been spraying weekly, and you want to see how good a job you're doing. And you might not find any maggots at all. That means you're doing a great job. But if you do find a few, you know that you might have some out there. That fruit then will have to be picked, taken to cold storage as soon as possible and kept there, if at all possible. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Valandia to finish us out today.
All right. So blueberries have the potential to generate a high net revenue per acre, but there are several years between the time the blueberries are planted and the time you get your first harvest. Therefore, the potential high net revenue is usually not realized until blueberries are in full production between years 5 and 6. Furthermore, blueberries are high input and they are labor intensive, requiring a lot of labor and management, especially when they're ready to be harvested. One of the most important considerations for producing blueberries is labor availability. As Dr. Hansen and Dr. Lockwood mentioned, one of the most important decisions a grower would need to make when considering producing blueberries is the site selection. Site selection would not only have an impact on crop quality and yield, that would ultimately impact the revenue side of the budget, but also market feasibility, specifically when producing fresh blueberries to be sold through direct-to-consumer market outlets such as farmers markets, roadside stands, and pick your own. In this table, you can see an example of the potential labor needs when producing blueberries when using various marketing strategies. There are 3 marketing strategies presented in this table. A strategy where 100% of the blueberries are sold at farmers markets, roadside stands, and or on farm, what we called retail. A strategy where 50% of the blueberries are sold retail and 50% of the blueberries are marketed using a pick your own strategy. And finally, a strategy where 25% of the blueberries are sold retail and 75% are marketed using a pick your own strategy. As you can see in this table, the highest labor needs would happen after year 3 for all marketing strategies, when we assume we will have the first harvest. In this example, we assume in full production, the yield would be 12,000 pints per acre. Assuming an estimated harvest rate for picking blueberries of 25 pints per hour, that means that you will need between 10 and 15 pickers to harvest 1 acre of blueberries. As you can see in this table, when using a pick your own strategy, there are labor savings associated with reducing harvesting and post-harvesting activities. Specifically, in the example presented in this table, the number of hours per acre, as well as the percentage of total costs associated with labor expenses, are reduced when incorporating a pick your own marketing strategy. It is estimated that 450 customers could harvest about 6,000 pounds of blueberries. It is important to note that when blueberries are marketed through a pick your own strategy, you should have some labor available to harvest blueberries in the parts of the field that are not harvested by the customers. It is important for spotted wing Drosophila control not to have overripe berries in the field. In this table, we present examples of blueberry costs for the same marketing scenarios presented in the previous slide. As you can see in this example, regardless of the marketing strategy used, costs associated with mulch application, harvesting, and post-harvesting activities are the largest expenses associated with blueberry production. The choice of marketing strategy would depend on various factors, including farm location that would determine the distance to customers and markets, and labor and time availability for marketing activities. The advantage of marketing blueberries using a pick your own strategy is the labor savings associated with reducing harvesting activities. As you can see in this example, the percentage of expenses associated with harvesting activities decreases as you increase the percentage of blueberries marketed using a pick-your-own strategy. As you can see in this table, the percentage of total cost associated with post-harvesting activities, including marketing, remains about the same level regardless of marketing strategy, to reflect the fact that although there are labor savings associated with marketing your blueberries through a pick-your-own strategy, there are other marketing costs that a farmer would need to consider when using this strategy. There are other considerations and costs associated with using a pick-your-own marketing strategy, including adequate parking areas, restaurant facilities, convenient and safe access, and adequate liability insurance. In the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, there are additional elements a farm business should consider when running a pick-your-own marketing strategy, including logistics to guarantee social distancing between customers, employee training, purchase of personal protective equipment, and portable hand washing stations. In this final slide, you can find the contact information of all the professors who contribute to this video. If you have any questions about blueberry production or about the information presented in this video, please feel free to contact us.